The 16th of August, 1977. That was the date that Elvis Presley died. It is also the date when three of Australia's most popular rock bands from the 70s and 80s played their first gig. I'm with Greedy Smith, singer from Mental as Anything. Greedy, it was Mentals, it was INXS, and it was Midnight Oil, all playing on that same date when Elvis died.
All at different shows, all in Sydney. Yes, it was quite strange. And we only all put it together probably about 10 years ago. So, did you start then? Oh, did you start then? So it was a bit like that. I remember it quite vividly.
How did it work out that it was actually the same date?
Because everybody knew where they were when they heard that Elvis had died. And I know specifically because we'd already been doing a few Elvis shows in our set. And Martin, our other singer, had painted a great big backdrop of Elvis because we were set to play that night at the art school at the Cell Block Theatre. And he put so we had the big backdrop and we sang some Elvis songs. So we remember vividly, it was the first night our bass player, Peter O'Doherty, played with us. So it was a very big thing. And we did lose Elvis, but I think music has still lived on.
Mm. Yeah. You can say that. I remember, as I've mentioned before, that you and I went to the same school, North Sydney Boys High. You're 6 or so years older than me, and I was at high school. I remember when Elvis died, and I remember as a student, following the Mentals, and you came and played at the school. What does it say to you that here we are so many years later, and these three bands remain so popular, and you're still playing?
I think it's just a great time to imprint music on the mind of people, because everybody's minds were fairly open because there wasn't much to do. We had in Australia we had 2 or 3 commercial TV stations and a government station. We had radio stations. We had a couple of top 40 stations that people would listen to. And I think then we're just starting to bring in one underground station. But basically, if people wanted music, they had to go out and get it. Now, where did you find music? Well, this goes back to the old days of licensing in Australia. People weren't allowed to drink after 6 midnight. They said they had to be at home having their dinner.
6 o'clock swill, right?
It was called the 6 o'clock swill because people had finished work at 5 and they had to get from work to the pub. And then all the taps had to stop at 6. So
when did that change? Was that late 60s, early 70s? Or?
Yeah, it's in the 60s. But so what had happened was that all the money behind these pubs, they built these huge big rooms that had a really long bar down down one side. Places like the Sundowner at Punch Bowl and the Coogee Bay Hotel. These really really big rooms, and then. When the licensing rules were relaxed, there was no need to serve that many people. So what happened was that bands like us, when they first formed in the mid to late 70s, could just go out to a public and say, "Oh, can we play here?" The publicans were looking for anything to get people into their room, and it worked out really well for them. So it means that people they're all drinking their beer but listening to their bands. So you could play. You play all over the place in Australia. I remember first being interviewed in 82 in LA. They said, "What's the live scene like in Sydney?" And I pulled out a copy of the Sydney Morning Herald guide, a gig guide, and it was, I don't think it was called that.
I know what you mean. Yeah, entertainment guide.
And there are like 1,000 different musical items over the weekend in Sydney. And I said, and look at Perth, and it's probably per capita. There's probably more. And that whole idea of so that everybody was seeing bands, that they could go and see a band at the pub, and there were video shops and renting videos to watch at home hadn't taken off, but at the same time the record companies had it sweet because there were three big programs in Australia that nationwide programs that we would do nothing but play the latest hit music and interview the artists. So that from that time, the people knew who the people were who were singing the artists, who were singing the songs, because they'd see them, they'd know what they were doing that week.
Yeah.
And it was a great time to be an artist, and I think that's why
great time to be a music fan too, because it was so cheap. $3 or $4 you can go anywhere on the North Shore and see the Mentals or INXS or even AC/DC in the early days. Midnight Oil.
I think you get an idea of it now, because I think a lot of radio stations around the world will play lots of 80s stuff, but they don't play much 90s stuff.
No.
Not as much.
No, they don't.
And I think it's because the 80s stuff really imprinted itself on the minds of the people. And the 80s music and the characters behind it imprinted themselves on the minds of the people who made it big when it happened. So while they're still alive, that's going, and now they're torturing their kids with it.
Yeah, well, with my daughter, I'm saying, this is Ganga Jang, or this is Mental as Anything. This is even Sherbet. I mean, Sherbet were, of course, a bit earlier, but they had some incredible songs when you look back. But, what really fascinates me is how this was a big part of Australia's coming out, wasn't it? With the bands emerging and getting international success. Live It Up was a song that the Mentals did that made it big in the UK and many other markets. But how important was that, do you think, to get the international success as well as the domestic popularity? I think
it became a thing because you could only do so many trips around the country with a 12-ton truck and all of this gear. And I also think that because there were all of these big bands came up, but then there'd be new bands behind them, and it sort of forced them out. So you'd have bands like INXS, Men at Work,
Midnight Oil,
going overseas and
Little River
doing
Band.
This tour. And they were
they went
Air
earlier.
Supply,
Yeah,
Air Supply,
yeah.
Little River Band. It became necessary for us to go overseas, and we did. But for me, I'm happy. So I've been rotating this country non-stop. The longest break I've had from touring in 42 years was 6 weeks in 1990 when I fell off a horse. That's the longest break I've had from touring. I feel a bit twitchy if I go, even if I have one weekend off or something. I feel a bit twitchy because I should be out there showing off somewhere.
With Greedy Smith talking about the Mental as Anything phenomenon and also the growth of Australian pop bands in the 80s and beyond. So, when we look at the way that the band evolved, of course, you had the art side of things with Mambo, and you were all artists. That's how you met. How much was that a big part of the popularity and what made Mentals different?
I think it gave us something to talk about, and it affected. It was great for videos, but a lot of the videos were made by other people we knew from art school who had been there. Coming out. So we had a lot of people.
If You Leave Me, Can I Come Too? That was a brilliant video, wasn't it?
Well, that was originally made in Tasmania, and part of it made in Sydney. It was made with the help of an old TV show called Simon Townsend's Wonder World originally.
Remember it well.
And so there are little bits and pieces that all came together because we're always making videos because we were putting. It seemed we seemed to put out a single every 3 months of the 1980s. Pretty close to it.
Yeah, it was. So what do you think the artists of today can learn from you guys? You're still performing, of course, but the new artists, whether it's Montaigne or some of these other artists that are coming onto the scene.
I think the main thing is to try to be near your crowd. I know people do it via social media, but in order to get in front of, I think people need to go to publicans and say, can my band play here? The deal mightn't be that good to start with, but if you bring people in, I think there needs to be an emphasis on live performance of about 200 to 300 people. That's the area which we operate in. I think just to make that connection with it. We get young people come to see us for the first time. Their eyes are wide open. They say, well, I've never seen it. See, that's how you play music. You're all playing your instruments. Because they're used to DJs. They go out and they'll see DJs to see you do that. And I think if people play instruments in front of other people and see that you can do it, I think that we took it for granted growing up because that's what people did. But these days it's like a new thing. We could be from Mars for some of these kids.
All right. Well, Andrew Greedy Smith, it's really wonderful to get your views on the music scene. May you long have continued success and don't stop playing and singing.
Just try and stop me. Thanks, Jason.